It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Happy Friday, folks. I got to tell you, these Fridays have always been great. They're just as great when you're retired. Don't worry about it. If and when you arrive at that retirement date, you're still going to like Fridays. It's all good. And today, I hope you saw the little advancer that we are doing for the show. We've got some hurricanes to talk about. And I kind of, in my mind, thought of this being maybe a Triple H podcast by George. We're going to be talking hurricanes, heat, and weather in the heartland. And of course, it's all connected to what I talk about all the time. And it's climate, war, and healthcare, the big three on the PBG. And this weather is connected to climate. I mean, you cannot separate the two. Exactly how they're connected, we're going to talk about. And we're going to bring in our good friend here, Dr. William A. Gallus, to talk about it. Dr. Bill Gallus is coming on the podcast by George Liveline. He's a returnee. He's a favorite of mine. I really like this guy. He's a professor of meteorology and has been at Iowa State University for over 25 years. His research interests include improved understanding and prediction of thunderstorm systems, their evolution, rainfall, and severe weather, as well as prediction of winds for wind energy. Convection allowing numerical models such as WRF are an important part of his research. He also looks at how climate change may impact extreme weather events. So as I mentioned, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Let's take that down off the screen, click a button here, and bring him in and say good morning to the doc. Hi, Dr. Gallus.
Hi, George. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for coming on. There's one thing about weather, and I kind of envy you this, having it for a career. I dealt with it, in my news part of my career a little bit, and it's weather. I mean, there's always something happening, and what's happening right now is ominous, let's say. Let me bring this up on screen, and you can talk us through this a little bit, but this is a slide that shows this storm that's going to nip the northeastern part of the United States, and it's a big one. Talk about this.
Right. This is Hurricane Fiona. So some of your listeners may have heard a few days ago, it caused huge amounts of rain in Puerto Rico, 2 to 3 feet of rain in the mountains. So it actually caused the rivers to get higher than they were during Hurricane Maria a few years ago, which was probably the most destructive hurricane in Puerto Rico's history. Well, now it swung by Bermuda last night. They had winds up to 115 miles per hour, and it is headed straight for Nova Scotia, where it's supposed to hit later tonight. What is special about Fiona is it's an extremely strong hurricane. It's a Category 4. I think last night it set the record for the most intense in terms of how low the pressure is in it, the most intense hurricane we've ever had this far north in the Atlantic. So the Canadians up there are bracing for some pretty horrible weather conditions with winds over a pretty big area. That the red colors you see on that map are hurricane warnings. So they might have winds of 100 to 110 or 120 miles per hour tonight, which would rank it as probably one of the most destructive hurricanes in the history of Canada. And the intensity, which we like to use, how low is your barometer in the middle of the hurricane? The intensity looks like it might break the Canadian record as the lowest pressure that they have ever experienced.
Okay, so I got to tell you, when I hear this type of thing, and I hear it all the time, I know that everybody does, biggest, most, highest. I look at this is on this barometric pressure thing in recorded history. We're talking, this is the lowest. I mean, why would that be? What can account for that? And I'm thinking climate.
Right. It's a combination of the climate change. I think this summer, the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean, which is usually pretty cold, is averaging almost 10 degrees above normal. I think it's a record heat wave up there. In fact, I think earlier this summer, biologists were more worried because those extreme values of heat were going to probably damage some of the sea life that isn't used to that warmer water. And then also it's a bit of a coincidence that Fiona is taking a track where it's starting to race now across that water. So that water is much warmer than normal. It's still not probably quite warm enough to maintain the hurricane as a Category 4, But it's certainly, since it's a lot warmer than normal, it's probably going to allow Fiona to have more strength than any other system has had when it reaches the shores of Canada.
Now, talking about that again, related to climate, I'm just a rube out here in the heartland, and I don't know much about hurricanes, I got to tell you, but they always talk about warm water and that having an impetus in creating these storms and promulgating them and making them stronger. And I thought, oh my God, like for instance, in the Gulf and probably off the Atlantic coast, that water has got to be getting warmer all the time. The whole planet is. But I don't know, is that actually borne out? Are we actually seeing more and more severe hurricanes because of the warmer's water, or is that actually suppressing some hurricane activity?
Well, the tricky thing is it takes more than just warm water to get a hurricane. And as the climate is warming, some of the other factors seem to be getting a little bit more hostile, not as favorable for creating hurricanes. So, I think the general view is what will probably be happening. We may not see more hurricanes as the climate changes, but when all the conditions come together right, now that the ocean is warmer than it's ever been before, we probably will start to see a larger fraction of the hurricanes are going to be at the high end. So we may start seeing, more intense ones, and we probably will start seeing hurricanes affect areas more strongly that used to have water that was too cool. I usually give as an example to my classes, I talk about New York City. New York City generally is far enough above the roughly 80-degree water temperature that hurricanes like, that it's hard to get a really strong hurricane up there. But with the water temperatures getting warmer, that 80-degree temperature line is getting up toward the New Jersey coast, making it more likely that a Category 3 or Category 4 hurricane at some point, could make a direct strike on our largest city.
Well, that's interesting because I've always thought it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when that New York City and those places get struck by a hurricane. I don't know, maybe it's the influence of big money up there. I mean, the Manhattanites and people like that think, well, that can't happen to us. I mean, that's something that happens in New Orleans and in places like that. But I kind of feeling that sooner or later, and it kind of looks to me like sooner, they're going to be affected. And it might be this storm. We looked at that track earlier, this particular storm, and I don't want to understate the significance of this. Let me see if I can bring it up on screen here again, Doc. This thing, as you mentioned, is going to have this immense impact on Canada, but depending on the track, this is going to cause some issues in the United States too, correct?
Well, fortunately, at this point in time, because it's racing north, if you notice that the white area on this map is the hurricane center, pretty much tries to nail down all of the reasonably possible locations that it might go. So you can see it stays very far away from New York City. They are having terrible rip currents, I've heard, along the East Coast. So I'm sure many people cannot enjoy beach vacations if they have them planned along the East Coast right now. But with this hurricane, New York City appears to be safe from any other impacts. What's kind of interesting, George, is this is a good lead in. There's another tropical weather system that is expected to become a hurricane that will likely become the major news story in the US next week. And that one could have maybe worse impacts on New York City down the road.
Okay. So, and that one is still out to sea in the Atlantic there. Now, I don't know that I've got a graphic of that. I've got the one of that may affect Tampa here. And that's kind of what I promoted for the show because.
And that is the same, right? That's the same.
Let me bring that up. So this is real early on this thing. I mean, it hasn't moved up into the Gulf Coast yet. This thing could have an impact on the eastern coastline of the United States as well.
Yes, this is a very interesting system. I think I can guarantee you that any meteorologist with an interest in hurricanes has been glued to the internet for days now. Our computer models, which normally don't do that great a job looking out, say, a week in time, have all indicated that this will become a very powerful hurricane somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico and very likely strike Florida at some point. And they've been bouncing around. So what happened of significance this morning is at 5 a.m., it finally began to get organized enough that we classify it as a tropical depression. So it has a number, Tropical Depression 9. And the latest advisory came out right as this podcast was getting started. said they expect it will become a tropical storm by tonight, and then probably a hurricane by Sunday night or Monday.
So it sounds again like we're looking at something, as you mentioned, these meteorologists are glued to the tube looking at this thing. This is going to be somewhat unprecedented.
Right. What is so impressive or scary, and I guess in some ways with this hurricane, is the west coast of Florida. It's relatively hard for them to get a direct strike by a hurricane because the hurricane almost has to move opposite in direction to what they normally do. They normally like to go from east to west, as you see, at the bottom of that image. But it does appear that the weather conditions are going to set up right to take it into the west coast of Florida. I think the only strong hurricane strike in the last 20 years there was almost 20 years ago when Hurricane Charlie hit in a location very similar to where you see the last little black dot on this map, which is where the Hurricane Center expects this hurricane to be at 2 a.m. on Wednesday. But some of the models have this as a category 3 or 4, so a major hurricane, and actually making landfall a little bit further north than what's shown on this map. And what's important about that is that's where Tampa, Florida is. Tampa has not had a strong hurricane hit it in about 100 years. It has grown explosively since that time. And many people say it's probably the most vulnerable city in the country to damage if a hurricane were to strike, because large sections where the millions of people live are relatively low, not too far above sea level. And in fact, there's an emergency management exercise that goes on there called Hurricane Phoenix. So they sort of a fictional hurricane that gets up to Cat 5 strength and hits just north of Tampa, so that all of the Gulf of Mexico water is forced into the bay. And if that were to happen, they expect that there would be a 42-foot tall wall of water plow into some of the areas there, with over 20 feet of water in downtown Tampa.
My God,
and
20 feet away. Yeah. I mean, you're going to need emergency water. I mean, you're going to need a boat to survive that. We think of the office buildings in downtown Tampa, but anybody that's a homeowner, my God, that's going to go over your roof probably if you're anywhere near the coastline.
Right. And the other big fear, so many people live there, it takes a while to get them all evacuated. And many people would have to evacuate if this does become a major hurricane, and it looks like it's going to go further north than what's plotted right now. And I know even right now, my wife and I actually honeymooned in the Fort Myers area.
Yeah.
That is also a very vulnerable area because most of the county is no higher than 15 feet above sea level. So you could pretty much have the entire county go underwater if the hurricane comes ashore just to the north, because it's the way the winds blow around it is going to push all the water into that area.
Well, I've spent some time there as well. And we started in Tampa. We moved south to Fort Myers. Go south further, and you're down in the Naples area, and some of the most luxurious homes of every movie star on the planet. That's Naples. But just literally a 5-minute drive, a 10-minute drive, you are out in the orange groves. You're out among the people that pick the oranges and live out there. I mean, again, this is an instance where these storms, and I think it's connected to climate, it's affecting the least among us. Those people, it would be catastrophic because there's no way their homes are going to survive this, and there's hardly any place for them to go. 'Cause, like you said, you can't run for higher ground. There ain't any.
Right. And in fact, there's still a couple possible scenarios where this hurricane would not cause a lot of damage. Some models suggest maybe it will cut up through the Everglades. But if it does that, then the Miami area, which has lots of people, will still be hit pretty hard. Or it may come ashore if it goes much further north in Tampa into what's called the Big Bend region of Florida. That area is relatively sparsely populated. But what's rather interesting is some of our models take this across Florida relatively quickly. And when it gets back out into the Atlantic, it then goes up the East Coast. So when you were talking about New York City, and I made mention that this system is the one that potentially could have a bigger impact on New York City. We don't know. I was thinking, how do you summarize a system like this? And it's something bad is very likely to happen next week, but there's 1,000 flavors of bad. We don't know exactly where we'll go. And a kind of a funny little story, we don't even know what to call this yet. There's another system right off the coast of Africa that is organizing at about the same rate that this one is. So both of them will probably become tropical storms in the next 24 hours. Whichever one does it first is going to get the name Hermine. The one that does it second will be Ian. So this one that will get all the attention in the media, it might be Hurricane Hermine, it might be Hurricane Ian, and the other one will disappear into the dust of history because it's not going to affect anybody. It's not going to last long, and the other one will get all the media attention.
Well, again, we're talking to Dr. William A. Gallus from Iowa State University, folks that are listening. Now, we're starting off with, hurricanes, and we're talking about Tampa and places out on the East Coast for my Heartland listeners, which podcast by George originates from. They're thinking, well, what are we talking about that for? Well, to me, it's all interrelated because of the climate, but we're going to get to some Heartland stuff here. But I wanted to continue here before we leave the topic of hurricanes to bring this up on screen and read into this a little bit and talk to the doc. Now, this type here is going to be very small, but this is some of the hurricane terms and the words that we use to describe hurricanes: typhoons and cyclones. Oh my, it says here. So, and I've highlighted a couple of things here, Doc. Just distinguish for us now, what is the difference as far as location and any type of thing on the storm itself between hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones?
So there's no difference at all in terms of what is going on weather-wise. They're all exactly the same. It's just a function of which part of which ocean you're in. So the name hurricane is what we use in the Atlantic, and those are the ones that cause the big problems in the US. So you're probably used to hearing hurricanes here. Also, in the part of the Pacific that borders the US, that we call them hurricanes as well. If you're in the western part of the Pacific Ocean, places like China, the Philippines, Japan, that is actually the most active part of the planet for having these systems, and they call them typhoons. And if you go into the area near Australia or the ones that affect India and South Asia, those are called cyclones. The Australians used to call them Willy Willies when I was a kid, which is kind of a fun name, but they've gone away from that.
Oh, okay. Let me bring this up on screen. We got a comment from a viewer, friend of podcast by George, Mary Knox. So, we were talking about Fiona, and Puerto Rico is going to be an issue, has been, and will be. She mentions that she still has friends down there. She says they have no power. I heard that they had a schedule to get that back on. I think they were hoping maybe within a week or so. But again, the devastation in Puerto Rico and other places on these homes, and I don't have any photos, but if you show them, they're not, they are devastated. I mean, they are wiped away almost, and we can't overstate the significance in Puerto Rico, Don.
Right. And, with this system with Fiona, the real problem was the rain. So there was terrible flooding damage. Roughly 4 or 5 years ago when Hurricane Marie hit, that one had 150 to 200 mile an hour winds. So that one pretty much erased the entire electrical grid. So it took a year. And I've actually heard things still aren't repaired to the level they were before that, which is why the power system is even more vulnerable than normal right now. But something your listeners may not be aware of, I've had several students from Puerto Rico, and they point out most homes in Puerto Rico are made out of concrete. So when you have a hurricane, even a powerful one like Maria that had the really strong winds, the homes sustain relatively small damage. Things like air conditioning units or solar panels get ripped off, and the power grid goes down. But the homes, are pretty sturdy. And I've had other students from around the world that think it's kind of funny how Americans build their houses as though, we're like in the Three Pigs story and we make our houses out of straw, or, they're not particularly built to withstand really high winds.
Well, we may change that. And I've had on my podcast this modeling, 3D modeling that they're using to construct concrete homes from, and specifically for that reason, to withstand storms and the changes that are coming to us all. Puerto Rico is a good example. One thing that they are always, that's a big problem, food, but water. I mean, that's always a big deal in Puerto Rico, and that's something that they're going to be struggling with for a while. Let me bring this back up on screen here because I want to keep going here because we've got a lot of things here to talk about. The 5 hurricane categories. The thing I wanted to talk about here, Doc, and but people can look at this. I mean, a lot of this has to do with the wind strength, but equally as devastating and deadly in these hurricanes are storm surges. I mean, what happens with the water levels? And you talked about Tampa. So, are the categories strictly based on wind and the damage that can be caused by the wind, or does it have to do with water level as well?
The system that we currently use is called the Saffir-Simpson scale. It only uses the wind. And for a long time, we thought that was okay because, the strength of the wind plays a large role in how bad the storm surge is going to be. But Katrina, and then a few years later, Hurricane Ike taught us that the ocean responds kind of slowly to the wind. And so you can have a hurricane that was very strong and is actually becoming weaker. Like Hurricane Katrina, for instance, was down to barely Category 3 in terms of its winds when it finally hit land. But while it was Category 5, it managed to pile up a huge dome of ocean water. And that doesn't go away very fast. And so it actually had a Category 5. So the storm surge was more like what you would expect with a Category 5 hurricane when it plowed into Mississippi. And Ike was an example. It had been pretty strong, but its big thing that caused damage is it was huge. And so the size of the hurricane also plays a role in how much of a storm surge it's going to build up. So there are scientists exploring ways to create a new scale that pretty much integrates, it considers and adds together the entire area being experienced by winds of a certain intensity. And that would probably better match what the public feels from a hurricane.
And I had that slide up there just very quickly before we leave the topic of hurricanes and the impact on human lives, which, of course, is first and foremost. I want people not to forget this, and it has to do with your pets. I mean, people along the coastlines are accustomed to and getting more accustomed to preparing, getting supplies, evacuating as necessary. And I don't know why people don't evacuate sooner. If it was me, I'm going to take a 2-week vacation. I'm getting the hell out of here. That's the way that I would look at it. People just need to pick up and move. But if they do that, Doc, they've got to have some concern over their pets, about their pets. And I've highlighted this. You just can't abandon them. You can't leave them behind. There are some very basic things that we got to do to take care of these family members. And that's how people look at it, their pets.
Right. I know that was a reason a lot of people didn't leave for Katrina. Many shelters don't take pets. I'm an animal lover. So, I mean, oh my goodness, if we got hurricanes here, I would not go anywhere without, a pet.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a way to make it possible that the typical shelter setup could house pets. I would be strongly in favor of that.
Oh, good. All right, great. Let me take that off screen here. I want to come back to the dock here and bring us up a little bigger. So we're going to move on here. I want to talk about what's happening in the heartland and just the whole country, the world, really, when it comes to heating and climate change. We're going to talk about that somewhat. But anything on the topic of hurricanes that we didn't mention, Doc, you talked about how these scientists are watching this closely. What would you advise, our friends and viewers on the show here? What should they be looking at here as far as the storm track and the information coming from the Hurricane Center is concerned?
I would think if you are in Florida or if you have friends and relatives down there, you would want to be paying attention this weekend to when different when different warnings are issued. This hurricane, if it bends most quickly to the east and is aimed for South Florida, it could arrive there already on Tuesday, which would mean people in the Keys would need to be evacuating probably already on Sunday at the latest. If it waits a little longer before coming in, like toward Tampa, it may not arrive till Wednesday or Thursday. So I know a lot of people down there already have gone to the grocery store to get bottled water, get supplies, because they figure once this hits the mainstream media, and especially if a hurricane watch were to go out, there'll be a rush on the stores with tons of people doing things. So it might not be a bad idea to be proactive and already get that stuff and realize a lot of it would keep a long time. So,
okay. My last question is, I had thought maybe this was going to be a quiet hurricane season because traditionally it starts with September. Here we are, we're, just a week or so away from being out of the month. but all of a sudden it doesn't look that way so much. Is there any reason to believe that maybe this is just going to, I mean, is it going to, does it have to quiet down in October or not necessarily so?
Not necessarily. It is a La Nina year on the planet where the water in the Pacific Ocean near South America is colder than normal. And those years are normally pretty active. So we were all very surprised that nothing had happened. But I think most of us were lulled into this false sense of security. After this event happens next week, at the moment, there's nothing else we see coming toward the US. But the consensus seems to be it will probably be a pretty active October and maybe even into early November.
All right, great. Let's move along here because I wanted to get to this part. This is something that jumped out at me. I wish I could have got to you about 2 weeks ago on this because this was something that was published in Bloomberg. Didn't get the recognition, awareness that it should. And it talks about how much of the U.S. will be in an extreme heat belt by the 2050s. And, for an old buzzard like me, 2050 seems science fiction. It ain't that far away, folks. I mean, 2050 is coming up. It says heat index temperatures will hit 125 degrees. These are heat index temperatures, 125 degrees, at least once a year in a band stretching from Texas to Wisconsin, researchers say. I'm showing this graphic here. These are the change in days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And now these places have temperatures 100 degrees above Fahrenheit, but these are increasing numbers of days, 100 degrees or greater. And look at this map. And again, the heartland, look at the top. I mean, we're talking about Iowa here. This is this heat band written by Leslie Kaufman in Bloomberg. Leslie writes, so you think it's hot out there now. Consider the number of 2053, the summer of 2053. That's what researchers at First Street Foundation, a New York nonprofit that studies climate risk, have done in a report published today. Again, this was a couple of weeks ago. They predict that in 3 decades, more than 100 million Americans will live in an extreme heat belt, Iowa, where at least one day a year, the heat index temperature will exceed 125 degrees. My God, folks, that's not just uncomfortable. That is deadly. The top level of the National Weather Service's heat index of the extreme danger level. Now, the index combines temperature and humidity, which we got plenty of here in Iowa, to arrive at how it feels when you go outside. Now, this may be kind of hard for folks to look at, but I thought this was a very accurate, very vivid depiction of what we're talking about here. On the left, these are counties above 125 degrees heat index in 2023. So this is what they're predicting for next year. Look at that. And you're seeing there out in the Mojave and in places like that in the bottom left of the U.S. map. Here in the heartland, we get some of that, some more than we have. This is 2023. But holy buckets, look to the right here. This is what we're talking about. 2053. We're talking 30 short years. I remember 30 years, folks. I may not be here for 2053, but 30 years ago to me right now doesn't seem that long ago. These are counties above 125 degrees. And again, this is the heat index. So they're saying this is coming. At least this is what their research is indicating, that it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when, Doc.
Right. And a lot of people don't realize here in Iowa, some strange things go on because our state is unusual in that it's basically one giant farm. We're covered with corn. Yeah. Corn is very effective at reaching down and pulling water out of the ground and then evaporating it into the air. We jokingly call it a swamp cooler. So our worst days in the summer already tend to be worse than what you experience in, the deep South or Florida. Everybody likes to complain about the South being terrible in the summer. They're only terrible because there's never a break in the summer. Luckily here in Iowa, it's usually just 1 or 2 days, get really hot and steamy. So that's why when you showed the map that said 2023, there already are times where we get close to 125 in the Midwest. So it doesn't even really have to warm up that much more before you'll see, the whole Midwest, the Corn Belt light up like a Christmas tree, which is what's happening in your map for 2053.
Oh, God. All right, good. So let's bring this one up. This is big where I'm at now. This is again something that varies according to where you live, even in our home state, of course, but everywhere, and it has to do with this drought. We are drought stricken where I'm at. Not so in other parts of the state, and not so in other parts of the country. I read just recently where Vermont had a completely normal year according to their indices. The state of Vermont, and of course that's up in the northeastern part of the country that controls the world, really. So I think it ain't normal around here. Let me tell you, this shows the seasonal precipitation outlook. This is when this is what they think is going to happen. And this is the equal chances in the white there of having normal precipitation. And below this dark area, this is extreme drought, I would imagine. And then, of course, the lighter tan area is where we're at. And there's drought all over, but they're not seeing any immediate break to the drought conditions affecting the center portion that are colored here, Doc.
Right. So yeah, this is a map where they try to forecast for the fall season the amounts of precip. And so that whole tan area into brown is where the chances, you have a better than 50-50 chance that it's going to stay dry. And as you mentioned, much of this area, especially from the Mississippi River west, is already experiencing drought conditions. So this map, suggests no real improvement west of the Mississippi. And in fact, the drought will make a bigger inroad into the eastern part of the country.
When I look at this blob in the dark tan out here to the west, when I look at that, what I think is irrigation. I mean, they got a lot of agriculture out there, folks, but it's all irrigating. Of course, they've sucked the water table dry in the Colorado River and places like that, or, that's turning into a creek, we used to say back in the day. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with this. It's unprecedented, and that's kind of where we started with the hurricane discussion. Nobody's ever seen this before. Now, this is the seasonal temperature outlook. This is the same type of thing, but only on not on precipitation, but on temperature. Talk us through this one, Doc.
Right. So this is suggesting, almost the entire country is going to have a warmer than normal fall. What's interesting is if you look at these predictions in the last 5 or 10 years, you almost can cheat. You can almost beat the skill of flipping a coin just by saying it is going to be warmer because the planet is tending to warm. It doesn't warm steadily. I like to compare it to taking a roller coaster at an amusement park, and what you're doing is you're raising the ground where it is. So you still have swings where you might have some cooler than normal months, but they're not going to be as much cooler than normal as they used to be. And more of the time you're going to be above normal. What's bad about this is you can see, that entire area we saw in the middle that's going to have a dry fall also looks like it will have a warm fall. And the warmer the temperature, the more you go evaporate the water out of the ground, add stress to the trees. So this would not be a good scenario for the West, where the fall tends to be forest fires, the peak of forest fire season.
All right, that's an excellent segue here. That can take us to where we're headed, which has to do with all of the smoke that's in the air and how that affects forecasting. Let me ask you this, Doc. I don't know if you've ever considered this. I wouldn't imagine this is a topic in one of your classes, but I would like to get your opinion. Because I've often thought this, but I don't know if anybody agrees with me. My wife hates this hot weather. It does not agree with her. I'm a hockey guy. I mean, I'm a winter sports guy, if anything. I mean, I can tolerate just about any kind of weather, but if I had my druthers, I'd rather that it was cold. Well, most people are not like that, particularly the urbanites, particularly the power brokers, the people in the big cities. They're living in air-conditioned domes almost. I've always thought if the weather change, the climate change that you and I talk about so often, if it was toward cold, where we were entering, freezing sub-zero, horrific cold weather, maybe it would get people's attention more. Maybe they would pay attention more. Maybe they would do something more if it was cold instead of heat that we're talking about. Do you think? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, is that a possibility?
I think they definitely would, because if you look kind of at the history of the world and peoples, generally cold spells have been the bad periods where many, many people die. You have famines, lots of sickness, etc. So yeah, we'd be in a worse situation if we were heading toward an ice age, if the planet was cooling. and I know what you're getting at more is the idea many of us like the comfy warm weather and sort of dread the winter cold. Perhaps that also plays a role. The big danger if we were cooling off is then we'd be starting to risk getting freezes in June and August, and crop failures big time. But I think maybe the problem is we're shooting up to like a level of warmth that the planet hasn't seen while there've been people around. So I think you sometimes hear people use this in a misleading way and say, well, a warm planet has always been the best scenario for people. And it's like, yes, in the past, but we're talking warmth where you're kind of waving around like that, not shooting way up.
Yeah. Well, let me, again, talking about warmth here, I am bringing this up on screen. Dr. Gallus knows those guys at the National Weather Service. They're getting kind of creative. I mean, I kind of like this. I mean, they're getting some graphic ability here. This is kind of cool. Records broken. You can see the record here. Again, we're talking about out of the heartland, daily records, preliminary data here. Des Moines, this is for September 20th, 2022. The new record, 94, 96, 92 up in Mason City. Late in the season for such heat, they say. At Des Moines, the latest in the year for 94 plus since 1963. At Waterloo, the latest on record for 96 plus. And several stations in Northwest Iowa topped 100. I saw that up in the Northwest. Only the third time since 1900 to happen this late in the season. So I thought that was kind of fun. So we got to move along here. I want to bring this up. This is depicting what I wanted to talk to the doc about. We're talking about how climate affects weather. And so how about smoke? You can get up in the mornings on certain days, walk outside and smell it. It is in the air. Well, that's got to be having an impact on us because we're breathing it. That ain't good. But it's also got an impact on weather. And in fact, we talk about drought. It could make rainfall less likely. What do you think? What do you think about that, Doc?
I've been aware of a few studies in the past that tried to look at this idea. I don't know if your listeners are totally aware, but every snowflake or raindrop has to start basically with a speck of dirt or pollution or dust. And it's very sensitive to kind of what's going on, the size and the amount. If you have too many of those, they're competing for the amount of water, and you might get tiny droplets that aren't able to start falling and banging into each other to actually form raindrops. I haven't read this particular study, so I'm not sure if they're focusing on that aspect of how smoke might reduce rainfall. But I do know that having smoke from forest fires far away does tend to cause problems with weather forecasts, because it can actually keep you a little cooler for your daytime temperatures because it blocks out some of the sunlight. And it's also possible there could be a feedback there. If you're not getting as warm, you might not be able to trigger, the thunderstorms that we depend on to get a lot of our rain during the growing season here in places like Iowa.
We focus on the United States, we focus on the heartland in Iowa, but this is planet-wide, folks. I mean, this is happening everywhere. Europe is burning up, or it has been anyway. Drought is every place. And one place that, of course, because they don't allow much news out, but again, we kind of look the other way, and we shouldn't, because my God, it's got more to do with virtually everything other than the United States, maybe, is China. Now, I heard that China was trying to create rain, Doc, that they're trying to seed clouds and stuff. Is that science really there? I mean, does that work, cloud seeding to create rain in a drought?
So this is a complex issue. It does work. I think there's a substance called silicon iodide that works really well if there's water vapor. So if there's kind of some gaseous water in a cloud, it really speeds along the process of collecting that water and forming drops to allow it to rain. But I think where people are very skeptical is there's only, the cloud has to have enough water in it and be the right kind of cloud for this to work. If you are doing this, there's concern that you're basically robbing, Peter to pay Paul, that the people that are downwind of you now won't have the moisture that would have led to rain there. There's concerns, how big a scale can you really do this on to make it worthwhile? They've been doing this in the US, some private companies in places like North Dakota, I believe to create rain, but also more to avoid getting big hail. So if you're like taking the moisture and spreading it on lots of little particles, it can make it harder to get big hailstones that cause damage. But
Oh,
yeah, China had the worst. China basically went through an unbelievable heat wave drought combination this summer. Some people have called it probably the most extreme heat wave in the history of people living on the planet.
yeah, and again, dealing with it and their concern over it, unlike our country, I think China will do something. I mean, they'll move, and they have the support of the people. They're not going to sit around and argue about it. I don't know exactly what they're going to do to confront the climate crisis, but I would keep an eye on China. That would be my recommendation. Now, before we leave weather, I'm going to bring this up. I'm going to play this clip because I got it. This is there we go. So that
A very classic tornado.
yes.
Perfect.
Out on the plains. Look at that. There's not a tree or a hill in sight. And, that tornado, Doc, it's backlit. And I mean, that makes for great photography. A lot of times they come down out of clouds and, at night you can't see them at all. But, if it's not backlit, you don't get a good look at it. That one you do. Now, you can't analyze that and tell if that's an EF 1, 2, 3, or 4 just by looking at that clip, can you?
No, if you were much closer, with the video camera, you can do something called video photogrammetry. Really big name, a good hangman word. But anyhow, you can try to track particles if you know how far apart each frame of your video is, and get an idea of the wind speeds, but certainly not from the distance of the video you played.
Okay, so before we leave weather and I'm going to talk about climate here at the end of the show because it's all about climate, war, and healthcare on Podcast by George, and whether or not we recognize it and whether or not we're willing to do anything about it. What about the year just passed, Doc? This was a weird one again, first ever, unheard of, unprecedented. We started off with those deadly tornadoes in March. We had this torrid summer. Last year, we had a derecho in the latter part of the year. What do you see for what's past, and what do you see for the future here in weather in this part of the country?
So it's been a weird few years in Iowa. Tornado season in Iowa normally is May and June, maybe the end of April. And a lot of us who anticipate that and like to chase tornadoes have commented, tornado season has vanished, it seems like, in Iowa. Those months have been really calm. This entire summer has been very calm for severe weather in Iowa. But you are right. If you go back to 2021, we had one of our biggest tornado outbreaks in July, which is normally a part of the summer that's getting pretty calm. Then we had the huge outbreak in December, which was extremely weird. And then the Winterset ones were the earliest that we've had an EF4 tornado in the country that far north. So yeah, it's too early to tell, have we gone into a totally new climate as far as tornado occurrence, where the weird parts of the year that were normally calm are where we get the tornadoes, and the part of the year that was active is now the calm part. And you mentioned about Iowa, how the summer was. I think overall in Iowa, the summer was not too abnormal. Temperature-wise, I think it was maybe a little warmer than normal. As for precip, it depended what part of the state you were in. The Northeast had a very wet summer. The South and the Northwest had a very dry summer. So it was a real mixed bag, the weather this summer. But the one thing that was for sure is it was peaceful and quiet overall in terms of severe weather and maybe even flash flooding.
Okay, good. We're going to turn to climate. I'm going to bring these up and I'm going to flash through these quickly because I want the doc to comment on these things because I get questions on Podcast by George, and I know everybody does with folks that they meet and come across. My God, I can't believe there are people out there that still don't believe in climate change, or they believe, I know somebody that believes the climate is changing because of windmills, because of wind turbines. I mean, it's just amazing, really, what's out there. So let me bring this up on the screen here. This 6 claims made by climate change skeptics and how to respond. So I want people to learn a little something on Podcast by George all the time. I thought this was great. So here are 6 that you're going to hear. And when you hear them, this is what you're supposed to respond with. Now, it says it's hard to believe, but apparently more than a few climate deniers still roam our ever-heating planet. According to a recent study in the esteemed science journal PLOS, people systemically understate their disbelief in human-caused climate change when answering surveys. Now, that's important. I talk about surveys and polling on the show all the time. People say, yeah, I believe in it because they know it's the brainiac thing to say. But deep down inside, maybe they're just saying that, folks. That's what they're getting at here. Skepticism is more prevalent than many of us realize. So, given the urgency of the climate crisis, it's crucial that we all do our part to educate any doubters we might encounter. Again, this is coming from Rainforest Alliance. That's why the Rainforest Alliance has compiled 6 arguments commonly made by climate change deniers, along with science-backed responses you can deploy to convince them of the truth. That climate change is real, number 1. Yeah, it's real, accelerating, and that we need to take bold action ASAP. Doc, I don't know if you guys talk about this in your classrooms or not, but this is number 1 for a reason. Climate denier claim this is the coldest winter that we've had in years. And we've talked about, Doc just mentioned, some parts of Iowa had more precipitation than normal. Some Vermont, as I mentioned, has completely normal weather this year. So much for global warming. I hear this all the time. Aha, global warming. But this is this distinction, Doc, between climate and weather.
Right. It's shocking how much our universe basically boils down in everybody to what we are experiencing. So you always need to let people know we're talking about global warming. So if you are having the coldest winter that you've ever had, you can't say anything about global warming. You have to do what the scientists do and average the temperature over the entire globe. And that's where we have the hard data. Yes, the planet is warming. And the issue is, like I said, I like to think of the temperature change like a roller coaster, but the ground is going higher and higher and higher. So your roller coaster is going up. But if you're on the roller coaster, and you go from the top and you plunge down low, you're still going to be like, oh, this is so cold. There can't be global warming. You actually have to take a step back and realize that your human body is not the greatest instrument and look at the data. And what you would realize is when you felt like, oh, it is so cold, this is actually 10 degrees warmer than it was, 20 years ago. And probably the only times you're actually aware that, oh, global warming is probably happening is when you're at the top of your roller coaster, because now it's hotter than it has ever been. But the interesting flip of that coin is scientists do try to say, likewise, you can't say, oh, I know global warming is happening just because you had the hottest day that you ever had. You have to really average everything over the globe to know, is the climate changing or not? And there's certain things we know are more likely. If the planet's warming up, yes, your heat waves probably should be getting more intense and happening more often. Same with drought. Same with getting dumped on with 5 inches of rain in just an hour. That all fits with the planet warming.
Yeah. All right, let me take it because we're running out of time here. It always happens because I'm a weather wonk, folks. I love to talk this stuff. But now we're talking climate change. It's natural and normal. It's happened at other points in history. I hear this from a lot of folks. They just want to not pay attention to it. They think it's cyclical, that it's going to change, that it has in the past. And that's just the way things are. Doc, what's your response to that?
Yeah, this is what is so hard when you're talking with somebody who's a skeptic like this is these arguments are half truths. It's like, yes, you could answer that what was in boldface there and say, yes, it has always happened in history. The difference is it's never happened this way. It has never shot up this quickly because the things we know that happen naturally take time to warm the planet and then it cools back down. This is happening so fast that it doesn't match anything we know that happens naturally. It does match the change we see in CO2, which has gone up faster than we've ever seen before, which I don't know, if I was a betting man, that really strongly suggests this is related to how we have changed the atmosphere.
Undoubtedly. Number 3, there's no consensus among scientists that climate change is real. Again, I hear this all the time. Every reputable scientist that studies this kind of stuff is on board. This is not true, Doc.
Right. Yeah. I like to say, oh, this is the argument that annoys me the most, but all of these annoy me. In fact, a study that had been done like 10 years ago that found, let's say, 97% of all climate scientists agreed that, humans are what is causing the climate to change. They redid it last year and came up, it was now 99.9%. And then the 0.1% was one person who realized they had answered the survey wrong. So they actually reached out to the authors. So we can say it's 100% of the scientists that are actually studying the climate are all in agreement now.
Okay, good. Number 4. And this is interesting because plants and animals can adapt. Now, the way that I hear this a lot of times, Doc, and you mentioned that you're an animal lover. God, if you don't love yourself, if you don't love your neighbor, love the animals. But a lot of people will say this could be the end of humankind. I mean, they will admit to that. They're looking. They believe in climate change, but what they want to say is, well, the animals will survive us. They will live beyond this. But Rainforest Alliance says, wrong again. That's not true.
Right. I would guess people make this claim because in the past, we can look and see that animals do have the ability to adapt. But again, in the past, the periods of warming are very gradual, and it takes time for animals to change and adapt. So again, that's a very misguided argument because we can't even really look back in the past and see such a rapid change in the temperature. And we can see that animals, having big impacts on them. The coral, for instance, was getting bleached by the hot temperatures in the ocean. So there's certainly a lot of evidence that probably plants and animals may not all of them certainly will be able to adapt as quickly that they need to.
Yeah, extinction. A lot of them are just going to cease to exist. And some of the animals will survive. And I don't think you could ever get rid of a shark or a crocodile or a cockroach. But a lot of these animals, including the furball friend in your house, they're not going to outlive us, folks. They're not going to survive this. Now, this is a weird one. I don't know that I've ever heard the previous 4 that we've had. I've heard a lot, Doc. But have you ever heard this? That climate change is good for us. Do you know what they're talking about here?
Well, this gets back to what I was telling you earlier, is if you look back, the several thousands of years that we have data, generally when the planet was warm is when civilizations thrived. People settled Greenland, for instance. When we would swing to a colder climate, like the little ice age in Europe, is when bubonic plague, all these plagues were taking place, people were dying, famine, etc. So, so that claim is again built on looking back at history. And people just need to realize the kind of warming we're experiencing now is not something we've seen before. So you can't really take the past and say, well, in the past, it actually was good when we were warm. It's like, yes, but not this warm and not changing to become this warm so quickly.
Number 6 now, and there are 6 here in total. It says, okay, maybe climate change is real, but there's nothing to be done. It's too late. And you can look at this a number of different ways. Now, I just had Rory Verato on my podcast, and he's a climate researcher. I mean, this guy's deep in the weeds. He gets it. What he says is, it kind of is too late for some of this. It's going to happen. And he has a very negative perspective. A lot of people, we're talking millions, maybe billions with a B, are going to die because of what's already happened. Now, that is debatable, but the fact that we can still do something to save the rest of us, that's not debatable. I mean, we can still mitigate this, but I've highlighted this, Doc. The 2 things that I've highlighted here is if, and anytime you talk about the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal that we're trying to reach and how that can mitigate, it's always if. Yeah, it's good to know these things that need to be done and how to address them, and we might get to some of that, but we got to do it. We can't just talk about it. It's got to happen, and it's got to happen now. And the other highlighted section is begin taking drastic action now, not Mickey Mouse 2 for a quarter Oreo nickel dime jive changes. I mean, we got to have big changes, Doc.
This gets into the idea of there's mitigation, which that's the idea. Okay, we've allowed this to happen for so long. It's in some ways it's too late. Well, that means we are going to have to spend money to make higher seawalls around some of our coastal cities. We're going to have to do things to help, spend more money than we used to just to keep people safe. And then there's also the idea of trying to slow or stop the warming. So you really do need to do both things. I always like the idiom, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. You could think, oh, I need to walk 1,000 miles. Why bother even taking a step? It's such a tiny thing. Well, you're never going to go the 1,000 miles unless you start taking a step. And the more steps you take, you'll find, okay, I can actually do this. So yeah, this is where there is a bit of a balance. I have given talks, and what I like to tell people is you should not be arguing that climate change is not happening. Okay, there's no debate on that. No debate should be happening. Where there is debate is what exactly now should we be doing? How much money maybe toward trying to stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere versus how much money in trying to live with the changes. So I would say that term drastic in the item that you put up there, that is where we need to have educated debate, because you certainly don't want to make a change so drastic that like the economy would collapse and suddenly 90% of the people in your country don't have enough food to eat. But this takes a lot of wisdom beyond what we as scientists know. Economists have to get involved, and sociologists and political scientists. So I like to say I have the easy job. All of the data in science says, yes, the planet is warming. It's due to humans putting, carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. The hard thing is, what do we do about it now? And that's where it is fair to have debate, because we don't have a scientific law that tells us exactly the right way to go forward. But my job's easy. I used to be a climate skeptic, George. I don't know if you knew that. Back in the 80s and 90s, I felt like we didn't have enough data to feel confident to say what was going on. We could see things were starting to go uphill, but it was a relatively short period. But then so much change since then, it became impossible to deny that, yes, the Earth is warming. It's warming quickly, and it's from things that humans are doing.
Okay, so we are just about out of time. Got a couple of minutes here. Now, Doc mentioned what should we do? What could we do? I'm going to run through these very quickly. We're not going to talk about each one individually, but this is what Rainforest Alliance says, what we can do. Reduce food waste. That is something that we ought to be doing anyway. As a matter of fact, a lot of these things are plant-rich diets. Again, in the heartland with this animal agriculture that we have, this is not a particularly popular option, but my God, there are people that believe that the killing of these animals and the confinement of them and just the raising of these millions of animals has got a lot to do with the degradation of the climate. Bolstering the position of girls and women. Now, this one's interesting. This, again, is something that I had not heard too much about. I want to read this. Project Drawdown says that expanding education for girls and increasing access to family planning could lead to reductions as high as 85.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050. Education helps women respond better to climate shocks, and giving women the knowledge and tools they need for reproductive control has a multitude of benefits for the planet. Okay, that's going to get into a lot of politics here, but to put it another way, the way that I've looked at it, I've oftentimes thought that, I don't know, us guys kind of lost our minds decades ago. The doc was talking about the 80s and 90s. We became self-immersed in ourselves and sports and stuff like that. And I thought maybe the climate scientists, the problem solvers of the future, were going to be the women. But I'm looking around now thinking, oh my God, they're wanting to focus on sports and stuff too. And instead of this curriculum and classwork, Doc, what's your experience now in the classroom? How about your class sizes in meteorology and climate? Is it growing, and are you seeing increasing numbers of women involved in your field of endeavor?
We are definitely seeing increasing numbers of women. I believe this is the first senior class. So I teach 2 required senior classes. The first one that is majority female that I have. So, and that's this is my 28th year of teaching. So that is definitely a trend we see. As for enrollments, they're bouncing around. Our senior class next year is going to be by far the biggest we've ever had. It's a real fluke how many people I'm going to have in my lab classes, which means a ton of extra grading. So I'm kind of dreading that in some ways, but it's fun. You're getting to know a larger group of students.
Good. Okay. Let me Just run through this list here. Tropical forest protection and restoration. Yeah, again, this is something they can guesstimate, but we have no idea the harm that we're doing to ourselves and the future of everyone on this planet by destroying these tropical forests. Agroforestry. Some crops like coffee and cocoa grow beautifully under the shade of larger trees, which you've got to have to do that. Okay, I'm going to take these off screen because we're out of time with the doc. I wanted to bring this up. I'm going to surprise him here a little bit. This is something that I saw online. I wanted to congratulate you, Doc, and just have you tell folks what this is. Now, this is a research achievement award that you won, and is it named after the guy that came up with the tornado scale, or what is this?
Yes, it's named after Ted Fujita, who did he was a genius and did tremendous work on understanding tornadoes. And so the first, the damage intensity scale for tornadoes was then named after him.
Ah, great. And so they recognized your work, that association does. Good on you for that. I mention all the time on my podcast when I read those bios, like I did yours at the beginning. I tell people that, when we get to be old and I've arrived, folks, and when we're gone and I'm not that far from it, all that's left behind really are these biographies, the things that you achieved, the things that you did. And hopefully it had something to do with helping others and keeping the planet alive. And so that's what that's all about. That's what that award is all for. And good on you for doing that, Doc.
Thanks.
Because, I feel bad. I tell people are going to just remember me as that loudmouth from Norwalk, I think, and you're being recognized by these professional associations for the work that you've done in meteorology and in climate. And I just think that's outstanding. Doc, anything in closing here? I'd love to give you the last word because you are the authority. You're the expert when it comes to this stuff. Anything to wrap us up here as we close?
We've covered a huge range of things today, so
Yes.
I can't think of anything we've missed, actually.
Ah, that's great. We'll have him back on again, folks. And he's a working man. We got to let him go. He's got to get back to the classroom. So I want to thank him for coming on Podcast by George. Doc. We'll revisit this again real soon.
Have a good day, George.
All right. And folks, if you like Podcast by George, if you like being able to ask questions, and again, thanks to Mary Knox for joining in here on Podcast by George with a couple of questions. Go to podcastbygeorge.com. That's the easiest place to select a platform. Facebook and YouTube. You see the live streams there. If you just want to get the replays, the recordings of the audio, you can pick a platform like Spotify, Deezer, Stitcher, iHeartRadio app, Spotify as an example, and hear the audio versions. But that is going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.